A renowned lawyer cannot believe it when he receives his client's daughter, identical to his deceased daughter, and wearing the same ring he had given her 20 years ago. Richard Coleman had always been a man of implacable logic and sharp reasoning. In the elegant and cold quietude of his office, amidst old law books and dark mahogany furniture, he often found himself lost in thought. It wasn't the complexities of the cases that haunted him, but the memories of his daughter Laura. That pain was like a specter that roamed the corners of his mind, always lurking, waiting for the moment to clutch his heart with invisible claws. It was a morning like any other, when Richard allowed himself, once again, to dive into the memory of Laura's soft voice, the laughter that once filled the house, and now seemed so distant like a far-off echo. Richard remembered the last conversation he had with Laura as if it were yesterday. She was radiant, full of life, making plans for a future that would never materialize. The feeling of helplessness that overwhelmed him when he received the news of her death still tortured him. He, who had always been able to control the most complex situations, was helpless in the face of life's brutality. Laura was only 19 years old when a stupid accident took her life, an accident that Richard relived in his mind night after night, trying to find meaning where there was none. He often wondered if life would have been different if he had acted differently, done something more to protect her. These thoughts consumed him in a spiral of guilt and sadness. It was a burden he carried in silence, hiding it under the mask of a confident and unbeatable lawyer. But deep down, the weight of this loss was more than any man could bear. Richard missed her presence, her smile, the deep conversations, and the silent hugs that said more than words ever could. His career had thrived over the years, but professional success was never enough to fill the void Laura left behind. Richard had thrown himself into work, seeking in legal cases and courtrooms a way to escape the devastating reality of his loss. On the rare occasions he visited the cemetery, Richard would stand before the headstone, his gaze fixed on the name engraved in cold marble. He whispered words of love, of apology, in the vain hope that somehow she could hear him. Deep down, he knew that these visits were more for himself than for her. It was his way of trying to find peace, even knowing that true peace would never come. Sitting in his worn leather chair, Richard Coleman held a small velvet box in his hands, his fingers caressing the soft surface. Inside it, an old ring rested, shining under the soft light coming through the window. It was a family heirloom, passed down from generation to generation, a symbol of love and continuity. He clearly remembered the day he gave that ring to Laura, his beloved daughter, on her 18th birthday. The smile on her face and the sparkle in her eyes when she slipped the piece onto her finger were moments he kept forever in his memory. The ring was not just a piece of jewelry, it was a promise. Richard always believed that, with that gift, he was offering Laura a piece of the family's history, something she would carry with her into the future. On that day, he made a point of sharing with her the stories behind the piece, of how his own mother had received the ring from his grandfather, and how he always believed that tradition would continue with Laura. The ring, to him, represented the continuity of life, the unbreakable bond between the past and the future. As he recalled this moment, Richard's heart tightened. At that time, he could not have imagined that Laura's life would be so tragically short. When she passed away, Richard made the decision to bury the ring with her, as a final gesture of love and devotion. To him, the ring was a link between their souls, something that would keep them connected even in death. Remembering that act brought a mixture of comfort and pain, for although he knew that Laura was at peace, the absence of that sparkle in his life was unbearable. In the years that followed, Richard avoided talking about the ring. It was a sacred memory, a part of his pain that he preferred to keep locked away in his innermost self. The few times he mentioned the piece were to close friends who knew the importance of that final gesture. They understood the deep meaning of the ring, but even they could not grasp the depth of the loss Richard felt every time he thought of the jewel now resting with Laura, buried in a place where he could never reach it again. On that specific day, with the velvet box in his hands, Richard could not prevent a solitary tear from sliding down his face. He knew that life would go on, with or without Laura's physical presence, but he could not deny the open wound her absence left. It was a cold and rainy morning when Richard received a call from an old client, Henry Ross. Henry was an influential man, powerful and respected, who had entrusted Richard with complex legal matters in the past. However, the urgency in his voice that day was different, carrying a weight that Richard could not ignore. He wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss a delicate problem involving his daughter, Amelia. Henry, usually reserved and impenetrable, seemed vulnerable, as if something beyond his control was about to unravel. Richard, always professional, scheduled the meeting for the next day, but the unease he felt after hanging up the phone was hard to shake. He had known Henry Ross for years, but had never heard much about his daughter. Amelia Ross was a 22-year-old young woman, discreetly kept out of the media spotlight, unlike her father. Richard did not know much about her, except that she had studied abroad and had recently returned to the country. The urgency and cautious tone of Henry suggested that something serious was happening, and Richard could not help but feel intrigued. The next morning, Richard arrived early at his office, mentally reviewing what he could expect from that meeting. He prepared his room with the same meticulous attention as always, organizing the papers and ensuring that everything was in order. When Henry and Amelia finally arrived, Richard greeted them with his usual courtesy, but soon noticed the discomfort on Henry's face. He looked older, more worn out, and his tie was slightly crooked, a subtle sign that something was wrong. Amelia walked in right behind him, and Richard's world seemed to stop. His heart leaped painfully in his chest, and for a moment he was breathless. The young woman standing before him, with her long brown hair falling softly over her shoulders and her clear eyes that shone with a mix of determination and vulnerability, was the exact image of Laura. He could not believe what he was seeing, as if time had folded in on itself, bringing back a living shadow of his past. Richard felt the blood drain from his face, and an intense cold spread through his body. The details were terrifying. Amelia not only looked like Laura, but she moved like her, with the same natural grace, the same lightness that Richard thought he would never see again. Every gesture, every look, seemed a painful replica of his daughter. Richard blinked, trying to dispel the hallucination, convinced that his mind was playing a cruel trick on him. But when Amelia smiled shyly as she introduced herself, he was transported back to a time when that smile lit up his life, before everything fell apart. It was as if Laura was there, standing before him, alive. While Henry spoke, trying to explain the situation that had brought them there, the words were lost in the void that was forming in Richard's mind. He could barely concentrate, his attention trapped on Amelia's figure, on every nuance of her expressions. She sat in the leather chair before him, and the way she crossed her legs and rested her hands on her lap was an exact reflection of how Laura used to do it. It was unbearable, as if someone had resurrected the past and cruelly placed it before his eyes. Richard could not shake the feeling that he was losing his sanity. He wanted to speak, but the words would not come. He felt a mix of shock, pain, and an unbearable twinge of hope, as if something inside him was about to break. His eyes swept over Amelia, trying to find a flaw, a trait that would break that terrifying illusion. But there was none. She was perfect, an exact copy of his lost daughter, and that terrified him. Reality seemed distorted, and Richard wondered, in silent panic, if he was on the verge of a breakdown. Finally, Richard managed to force out a few words, his voice sounding distant and strange even to himself. "Amelia, it's a pleasure to meet you." He extended his hand, slightly trembling, feeling the cold and firm touch of her hand in response. As he felt her skin, Richard was overwhelmed by a wave of memories, of touches he thought he would never feel again. It was as if Laura's presence was there, materialized in a way he could never have anticipated. The emotional impact was overwhelming, almost knocking him down. As Richard tried to regain his thoughts after the intense déjà vu sensation that Amelia had provoked, something in her hands caught his attention. During the conversation, his eyes fixed on Amelia's right hand, where she unconsciously twirled a delicate ring on her finger. The world around Richard seemed to stop again, but this time, the shock was even deeper. It was impossible. The ring Amelia was wearing was identical to the one he had given to Laura on her 18th birthday, the same ring he had buried with his daughter. Richard's throat tightened, and he had to make an effort to control the breath that suddenly became short and irregular. The ring was unique, an old piece that had been in the family for generations. Every detail, from the intricate filigree design to the small blue stone that shone in the center, was exactly as he remembered. The sight of that jewel on another finger, on the hand of a young woman who was the very image of Laura, was more than Richard could bear. He tried, unsuccessfully, to find a logical explanation for what he was seeing. What did that ring mean there? How could a jewel buried with his daughter reappear in such a surreal context? Richard felt overwhelmed by a wave of nausea and fear, as if the ground was opening up beneath his feet. His mind raced in circles, desperately searching for an answer that made sense, but all he found was a growing confusion. He wanted to ask Amelia about the ring, wanted to know where it came from, who gave it to her, but the words stuck in his throat. Amelia, oblivious to the storm her ring had unleashed in Richard, continued to speak calmly, explaining the complicated situation she was facing. But to Richard, her words were now just a distant noise, muffled by the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. He was obsessed with the ring, unable to take his eyes off the jewel that subtly sparkled with each of Amelia's movements. It was as if the past was screaming at him, demanding attention, forcing him to confront a truth he was not ready to accept. Finally, when Amelia made a gesture with her hand, Richard could no longer contain himself. "That ring, where did you get it?" The question came out more like a strangled whisper than a normal speech. Amelia, visibly surprised by Richard's abrupt change in tone, looked at him with slight curiosity. "This ring?" she asked, looking at the piece on her finger, as if it was the first time she was really paying attention to it. "It was a gift from my mother. She said it had been in the family for many years." Amelia's words echoed in Richard's mind like thunder. He could not believe what he was hearing. The piece of history that belonged to his own family was now in the possession of another, as if it had simply changed hands in the time he wasn't looking. What once seemed like an immutable symbol of eternal love and loss now seemed like an impossible bridge between two worlds, two times, two lives. Was it a nightmare or a miracle? He didn't know, but the fear and confusion filled his heart. Amelia, unaware of the emotional abyss Richard was about to fall into, continued talking about her situation, but he could barely hear her. Reality seemed to fold in on itself, the lines between past and present blurring in ways he never imagined. He struggled to focus, but every word she said sounded like an echo of Laura, bringing to the surface an avalanche of emotions he was not prepared to face. The office, once a refuge of logic and control, now felt like a theater of emotional horrors. When the meeting ended, Richard stood there, motionless, while Henry and Amelia prepared to leave. He knew he should say something more, do something, but all he could do was watch as Amelia stood up, her graceful movement, and headed to the door. After Amelia and Henry left the office, Richard was alone in his room, paralyzed by shock. The ring he had seen on Amelia's finger continued to spin in his mind, like a repeated image in an endless loop. Every detail of the encounter seemed distorted, like a dream turning into a nightmare. He slowly rose from his chair, feeling the weight of a reality that made no sense. As he approached the window, he looked at the hazy horizon, but the familiar landscape did not bring him the usual comfort. Nothing seemed real. He was trapped in a world where the impossible had become possible, and that terrified him. Richard tried to take a deep breath, calm the thoughts that ran wild, but it was useless. He began to question his own sanity. Was his mind playing tricks on him? Could he be losing control of reality, confusing deep desires with the truth? Amelia's face, identical to Laura's, and that damned ring. Everything seemed to come from a delirium, a cruel trick of his mind worn out by pain and guilt. Richard had always prided himself on his mental clarity, on his unshakable logic, but now he felt on the edge of an abyss, where nothing was certain, nothing was safe. Deep down, Richard knew something was deeply wrong. but he didn't know what. He approached the desk where Amelia's folder was still open, with papers scattered. He tried to focus on the details of the case, something that had always brought him stability, but the words seemed to jumble on the pages. He began to doubt everything. Did Amelia really exist? Was Henry, his longtime client, involved in some complex and sinister plot? Or maybe everything was just a product of his mind, a hallucination created by grief, a bizarre way of coping with the loss of his daughter? The line between the real and the imaginary seemed to have faded, and Richard could not find his way back. Every thought seemed to crumble before it could fully form, leaving him trapped in a labyrinth of uncertainties. Finally, Richard sat down again, holding his head in his hands, his thoughts spinning out of control. He didn't know what to do, how to react. Everything he had ever believed was being challenged, and he didn't know if he was strong enough to face it. The anguish that consumed Richard would not leave him alone. Even with the feeling that he was on the brink of a collapse, he knew he needed answers. That same night, as the rain softly beat against the windows of his house, he sat at his desk, determined to begin his own investigation into Amelia Ross. He started with the internet, browsing news sites, social media, and public records. Amelia Ross was a young woman almost invisible in the digital world, with few mentions and scattered photos. This intrigued him even more. How could the daughter of such an influential man like Henry Ross have left so few traces? Richard found only a few photos from social events, where Amelia appeared next to her father, always discreet, always smiling. But in each image, the resemblance to Laura was shocking, almost disturbing. He spent hours examining every detail, looking for a clue that could explain the inexplicable. Richard then turned his attention to the past of the Ross family. He had resources and contacts he could use to get deeper information. He began making calls, discreetly asking old colleagues and acquaintances about Henry and his family. As the information began to come in, Richard felt a growing tension. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but still disconnected, scattered across decades of stories and secrets that no one seemed willing to easily reveal. In a moment of impulse, Richard decided to visit some places that could give him more clues. Richard's search led him to Amelia's old school, where he spoke with former teachers and staff. Everyone had good memories of the young woman, describing her as a brilliant but reserved student. However, something in the description seemed dissonant, as if there was a superficial layer of normality hiding something deeper and more disturbing. One of the teachers, an elderly man with tired eyes, hesitated before mentioning that Amelia always had an aura of mystery around her, something he never fully understood. Each new piece of information seemed to raise more doubts than answers, but Richard did not give up. He sought medical records, tried to understand Amelia's story from her birth to the present. There were gaps, moments in her life that seemed intentionally obscured. Determined that he needed help, Richard contacted a trusted private investigator, someone who had worked with him on difficult cases before. He knew he couldn't do everything alone and that an external perspective could bring a different insight. The information Richard began to receive from the private investigator made him more uneasy. The Ross family story, which initially seemed solid and impenetrable, began to reveal cracks, strange details that didn't fit the carefully constructed public image. Henry Ross, always seen as a successful businessman and devoted father, had a past shrouded in mystery. There were mentions of frequent trips, shady business deals, and broken relationships that were never fully explained. Every new detail that emerged brought more doubts, more unanswered questions. One of the most disturbing points was discovering that Amelia was not Henry's only child. Before her, there had been another child, a girl who, according to records, mysteriously disappeared when she was only 3 years old. The documents were vague, as if someone had deliberately erased parts of the story. Richard was perplexed to learn that the existence of this child had never been mentioned in public, not even to the closest friends. What could have happened to her? And why was the story so carefully hidden? Another unsettling discovery was about Henry's wife, Margaret. Little was known about her life before marrying Henry, but the investigator found evidence that she had spent time in a rest clinic shortly before Amelia's birth. The circumstances surrounding this period were murky, with incomplete medical records and contradictory testimonies. There were rumors that Margaret suffered from an unstable mental condition, something the family desperately tried to keep secret. Richard began to wonder what kind of impact this could have had on Amelia, and why these details were so buried. As he dug deeper, Richard found a name that repeatedly appeared in old files: Dr. William Carter, a renowned psychiatrist who apparently had a close relationship with the Ross family. The doctor's name came up in contexts that made no sense: appointments scheduled at odd times, home visits that were not properly documented. Richard decided to search for more information about Dr. Carter, but the man seemed to have completely disappeared in recent years. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only a trail of appointments and cryptically incomplete notes. As Richard delved deeper into his investigation, he began to notice unsettling patterns that directly linked him to Amelia Ross' life. Initially, the details seemed to be mere coincidences, small similarities he tried to ignore. However, as more information emerged, he could no longer deny that there was an inexplicable connection between his daughter Laura's past and the young woman who now occupied his thoughts. It was as if Laura and Amelia's lives were intertwined in a way that defied logic and reason. One of the first clues that caught Richard's attention was an old diary of Laura's that he found in a box stored away for years. In the yellowed pages, he read about a mysterious friend Laura mentioned in her last months of life. She described casual encounters with someone who seemed to know more about her than they should, someone who made her feel watched, but at the same time curiously attracted. The name of this friend was never mentioned, but the way Laura wrote about him, with a mix of fascination and fear, left Richard deeply disturbed. He began to wonder if Amelia could somehow be connected to this enigmatic figure. Another disturbing detail emerged when Richard began to cross-reference the places Laura frequented in the months leading up to her death with Amelia's records. He discovered that both had spent time in a small town in the countryside, in different years, but frequenting the same places: a small bookstore, a charming cafe on the corner of a square, and even a modest boarding house where both had stayed. The coincidence seemed surreal, as if Amelia was following in Laura's footsteps without even realizing it. Richard felt a chill run down his spine when he realized that these places, which he thought were connected only to his daughter's memories, were now connected to Amelia. On another occasion, Richard found a photograph of Laura at a birthday party that, at first glance, seemed ordinary. But on closer inspection, he noticed a figure in the background that looked like a younger version of Henry Ross. The coincidence was too disturbing to be ignored. How was it possible that Henry was present at such a personal event without Richard knowing? His presence in that photo, almost like a shadow, made Richard question whether his daughter's life had been manipulated in ways he had never noticed. A conversation with an old friend who had been a classmate of Laura's at university brought up more doubts. The friend mentioned that Laura used to talk about a girl she had met, a young woman who seemed mysteriously familiar, although Laura could never quite remember where she knew her from. The feeling that there was an old and dark connection between his family and the Ross family became impossible to ignore. Richard felt as if he was descending a dark path, where each step took him deeper into a story he didn't fully understand, but that consumed him from within. Richard's relentless search led him to an old file he had set aside for years. It was a box of documents that had belonged to his late wife, Emily. He hesitated to open it, knowing that its contents would bring up painful memories, but something inside him compelled him to continue. As he sifted through the papers, yellowed with time, he found a letter, handwritten, with Henry Ross' name on the header. The handwriting was Emily's, and the contents of the letter left him stunned. In the letter, Emily described a meeting she had had with Henry many years before Laura's birth. She spoke of a difficult decision they had made together, something she had never been able to share with Richard. The revelation was like a direct blow to his soul. Emily and Henry had had a relationship in the past, something Richard had never imagined. But what terrified him the most was what was implied in Emily's words. Laura was not Richard's biological daughter, but Henry Ross. Richard fell heavily into the chair, feeling as if the world around him was collapsing. How could he not have known this? How could Emily have kept such a devastating secret for so long? The idea that Henry was Laura's real father filled him with a mix of anger, betrayal, and despair. Everything he believed about his life, his marriage, his role as a father, had been built on a lie. Looking at the letter, Richard began to realize that this connection was no coincidence. Amelia and Laura were linked in ways he could never have imagined, not just by fate, but by blood. Henry, it seemed, had manipulated circumstances in ways Richard could not fully understand, perhaps even influencing the events that led to Laura's death. The feeling of being caught in a web of family conspiracies became unbearable. Stunned by the revelation, Richard began to connect the dots. Amelia was not just a young woman who looked like Laura by chance. She was her half-sister. The discovery of this buried truth shed new light on the disturbing coincidences he had been observing. Amelia and Laura not only shared physical traits, but a fate that seemed orchestrated by forces beyond their control. Richard did not know if Henry knew he was getting so close to the truth, but the idea that his daughter had died amid a dirty game of power and secrets filled him with a fury he had never felt before. Richard couldn't take his eyes off the ring that Amelia was wearing. The revelation about Laura's parentage had already shaken his foundations, but the mystery of the ring remained a constant shadow in his mind. Determined to uncover the truth, he began investigating the origin of the jewel, an artifact he had always believed to be a Coleman family relic, passed down from generation to generation. But as he dug deeper into the ring's history, he discovered that its origin was much older and darker than he had imagined. Through ancient records and contacts in antique circles, Richard traced the ring's history back centuries, long before it reached his family. The ring had a noble origin, but it was not just a valuable piece. It was wrapped in legends about power and curse, passed down through aristocratic families as a symbol of protection, but also of tragedy. Every family that possessed it seemed to be marked by dark events, mysterious deaths, and buried secrets. The ring was known to bring fortune, but at the cost of great sacrifices. What disturbed Richard the most was discovering that the ring had been associated with an ancient secret society whose members believed it possessed supernatural properties. These individuals, operating in the shadows of European courts, used the ring as a symbol of their alliance and, it seemed, of a dark pact involving bloodlines. The discovery of these stories shook Richard deeply. How had this jewel, wrapped in so many legends and stories of misfortune, ended up in the hands of his daughter, and now Amelia? Continuing his research, Richard discovered that the ring had passed through several hands before reaching his family. In each generation, it seemed to choose a bearer, someone whose life would be deeply affected by its power. As he delved further, Richard found a disturbing connection. All the families that had owned the ring over the centuries were somehow linked to the Ross family. It was as if the ring's fate was inextricably tied to that lineage, crossing continents and centuries to reappear in Amelia's life. The stories about the ring became even more sinister when Richard discovered that it was considered a symbol of dominion over the fate of others. There were records of ancient rituals performed to activate the ring's power, rituals that involved sacrifices, not of objects, but of people. Although these practices seemed archaic and shrouded in myths, Richard could not ignore the disturbing pattern that emerged. In each generation, a tragedy accompanied the ring, as if it demanded a price for the luck it brought. Richard realized that the ring was not just a family ornament, but a piece in a much larger game, a game of power, control, and destiny that spanned centuries. The link between the ring and Laura's death began to seem more plausible, especially when he considered the hidden forces that seemed to be conspiring around him. Had Laura, upon receiving the ring, been marked by this dark fate? And now, with Amelia wearing the same jewel, was the cycle about to repeat itself? Richard's search led him to an old manuscript found in a private library in Europe, which contained frightening details about the ring and its curse. This manuscript accurately described a specific lineage that, over the centuries, had tried to control the ring's power for its own purposes. This lineage was surprisingly familiar to Richard. It was a combination of his own ancestors and the Ross family. The connection between the two families was not just a coincidence. It seemed to be the culmination of an ancient plan, where the ring played a central role. Richard knew that to understand what really happened to Laura, he would need to revisit people and places he had deliberately left behind. The pain of his loss had been so great that, for years, he avoided any contact with those who were part of that past. Determined to follow every lead, Richard sought out another old acquaintance, the detective who had investigated Laura's accident. Aged and more cynical over the years, the detective received him with a mix of curiosity and distrust. "I never thought you'd touch this case again, Richard," he said, lighting a cigarette. "What are you looking for now?" Richard explained the new discoveries, the connections he had made, and watched as the detective narrowed his eyes, thoughtful. "There was always something odd about this case," the man admitted, releasing a cloud of smoke. "Some of the evidence just didn't make sense. But in the end, it was easier to believe it was just a tragic accident." The detective's words only reinforced Richard's conviction that there was something much bigger at play. With each conversation, Richard felt he was getting closer to a dark truth. He even sought out the family doctor, who had treated Laura in the months leading up to her death. "Laura was fine physically," said the doctor, looking Richard directly in the eyes. "But there was something about her, a restlessness that I couldn't diagnose. She was constantly exhausted, as if something was draining her. When I asked, she only mentioned that she was having recurring nightmares. I should have done more, but at the time, it just seemed like stress." Desperate for more concrete answers, Richard returned to the house where Laura grew up, now empty, but still full of echoes of the past. Every room, every hallway, seemed to hold secrets he had ignored. He searched Laura's room, looking for something he had missed, and found a small notebook hidden in the back of a drawer. The last pages were filled with scribbles and disturbing drawings, strange symbols, eyes that seemed to watch, and disjointed notes about secrets that should not be revealed. Richard recognized some of the symbols from the ancient manuscripts he had studied about the ring, and his heart raced. Laura knew more than he ever imagined. The revelation of everything that had been buried in the past left Richard in a state of deep anguish. He now had a truth in his hands that could destroy lives, a truth that could finally bring justice to Laura's memory, but at a cost he could barely calculate. Richard spent sleepless nights, tossing and turning in bed, his mind constantly tormented by this moral dilemma. He wondered if he had the right to expose Amelia to the truth. She, who knew nothing about the ancestral weight she carried, about the role she played in a story that began long before her birth. Richard knew that revealing everything to Amelia could destroy her, could make her a prisoner of a fate she never chose. But how could he remain silent, knowing that this dark truth was poisoning their lives? He began to avoid Amelia, fearing that every time he saw her, the guilt would become unbearable. But at the same time, he couldn't completely distance himself. There was an urgent need to protect her, to keep her away from the darkness he had unearthed. Richard wondered if, by choosing silence, he was sparing Amelia, or just postponing the inevitable. And what about Henry? Confronting the man he now knew to be Laura's true father, who had kept such terrible secrets, seemed like a monumental task, a battle he wasn't sure he had the strength to face. Richard began visiting Laura's grave more frequently, seeking answers that no one else could give him. Sitting on the cold grass, looking at the stone bearing his daughter's name, he tried to find the strength to decide what to do. "What would you do, Laura?" he murmured, hoping for a sign, an answer that never came. The wind blew softly, as if the world outside continued indifferent to the torment he was living. And amid the silence, Richard realized that, regardless of the choice he made, the shadow of doubt would always accompany him. In the days following his discoveries, Richard noticed that he was getting closer to Amelia, almost against his own will. She began visiting him more frequently, apparently seeking comfort in his company, unaware of the whirlwind of emotions he was facing. Richard, in turn, found himself studying her every movement, every expression, looking not only for the similarities with Laura, but something deeper, something he couldn't name, but that irresistibly attracted him. At first, Richard forced himself to maintain an emotional distance, fearing that getting too close to Amelia might drag him even further into an abyss from which he might not be able to escape. However, there were moments when, observing Amelia, he was overcome by a strange sensation of déjà vu. She smiled with the same tenderness as Laura, had the same delicate gestures that he had forgotten over time, but there was something more, an intensity in her eyes, a depth that Laura did not have. It was as if Amelia carried within her the wisdom of past lives, an emotional baggage that did not match her age. Amelia, for her part, seemed increasingly comfortable around Richard. She began to confide in him, to talk about her uncertainties and fears, things she didn't share with anyone else. Richard listened attentively, trying to offer advice, but at the same time, each word of hers brought him closer to a truth he didn't want to face. The relationship between them became a delicate dance, where both tried to navigate the turbulent waters of their emotions without drowning in the past that haunted Richard. One afternoon, while they were walking together in the park, Amelia mentioned finding an old diary of Laura's, something she had stumbled upon at her father's house. Richard's heart raced upon hearing this, but he managed to stay calm. "What did it say?" he asked, trying to hide the anxiety in his voice. Amelia hesitated, looking at the horizon before responding. She talked about things she didn't understand, feelings that disturbed her. Sometimes, it seemed like Laura knew something was wrong, but didn't know what it was. Amelia's words hit Richard like a blow. He knew that Laura's diary could contain crucial clues, but at the same time, he feared what he might find there. Then Amelia did something that took him by surprise. She held his hand, as if seeking comfort. Her touch was warm, comforting, and for a brief moment, Richard closed his eyes, allowing himself to forget everything. But when he opened them again, he saw not just Amelia by his side, but the specter of Laura, so close and so distant, intertwined in a reality he could barely comprehend. As the days passed, Amelia's presence became a constant in Richard's life. He found himself eager for her company, waiting for her visits like an addict waits for the next fix. But along with this closeness came the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. Richard began having disturbing dreams, where he couldn't distinguish between Laura and Amelia, where the two merged into a single figure that watched him in silence, as if waiting for him to make a decision he wasn't ready to make. The duality in Amelia began to haunt him. Richard realized that the closer he got to her, the more he seemed to be drifting away from reality. He began questioning everything, including his own sanity. Was Amelia real? Or was she a reflection, a projection of what he wanted to see? Every time he looked at her, he saw traces of Laura, but he also saw something more, something that terrified him. It was as if Amelia was a portal to a past he didn't want to relive, but which he was somehow doomed to face. One quiet afternoon, as Amelia read to him a passage from Laura's diary, Richard realized how deep the bond between them was. Amelia seemed to channel Laura's emotions, speaking with a voice that resonated like a distant, yet familiar echo. Amelia was increasingly present in his life, and the feeling that something bigger connected them made it impossible for Richard to simply turn his back. She was a living link to the past, a key to the puzzle he had been struggling so hard to solve. But the more time he spent with her, the more Richard realized that the truth might be unbearable. He began to wonder if his obsession with answers was, in fact, ruining what was left of his sanity. Perhaps, he thought, it was better to leave the past buried, to allow Laura's memories to remain unsullied. One afternoon, while Amelia spoke about her own insecurities and the dreams that had been disturbing her nights, Richard felt the weight of the decision he needed to make. He could finally open the diary that Amelia had brought, or he could lock it away forever in a drawer, choosing the comfort of ignorance. He knew that the contents of that diary could confirm his worst fears, could reveal truths that would not only destroy the image he had of Laura, but also end the only hope he had for redemption. That night, Richard sat alone in his office, Laura's diary before him, still closed. The darkness around him seemed to reflect the state of his mind, a silent void, where the smallest spark could trigger an explosion. He ran his hands through his hair, feeling the weight of exhaustion and the crushing pressure on his shoulders. Richard picked up the diary with trembling hands, his emotions swinging between fear and determination. He knew that the truth was a heavy burden, but he also understood that continuing to live in uncertainty was a different kind of torment. Amelia knocked on the door, calling him softly, and Richard hesitated before responding. He felt that if he let her in, his decision would be made. He could no longer hide anything from her, not after all they had shared. But if he kept her away, he could preserve the small bubble of normality that still remained. However, when he looked into Amelia's eyes as she entered, Richard realized he could no longer run away. She too was seeking answers, and he had no right to deprive her of the truth, no matter how devastating it was. Finally, Richard made a decision. He took a deep breath and opened the diary, feeling a mixture of dread and relief as he saw Laura's words before him. The weight of that choice was overwhelming, but Richard knew he could not live with the doubt. Each page he turned seemed to tear a piece of his soul, but at the same time, he felt that he was finally confronting the demons that had tormented him for so long. Amelia was by his side, silent but present, like an anchor that kept him from completely losing himself in the chaos of his emotions. As Richard read, Laura's words revealed secrets he could never have imagined, secrets that linked his daughter to a fate he had not realized. The dilemma he faced was resolved, but the resolution brought with it a new pain, a pain he knew he would have to carry for the rest of his days. The choice he made was not the easiest, nor the safest, but it was the only one he could live with. And as he looked at Amelia, Richard saw in her eyes a deep understanding, as if she knew that regardless of what the future brought, they would face it together. The revelation of the truth was such a devastating blow that, for a moment, Richard could not breathe. Laura's diary, with its pages marked by painful confessions and deep fears, revealed what he most feared. Laura had discovered the truth about her origins, about the ring, and about the dark legacy that surrounded both families. She knew that Henry was her real father, and that her life was inextricably tied to a destiny she could not escape. Laura's last words in the diary were a silent cry for help, a plea for protection that was never answered. Richard closed the diary with trembling hands, feeling the unbearable weight of the truth he now knew. The pieces of the puzzle finally fit together, but instead of bringing relief, they brought an even deeper pain. He realized that Laura's death was not an accident, but the result of forces he could never have foreseen or controlled. The conspiracies, the ancient secrets, the cursed ring. It was all part of a cruel destiny that had been decided long before he even met Emily. The sense of helplessness crushed him, as if he were facing an invisible and invincible enemy. Amelia, who had been by his side during the reading, watched Richard in silence, her own eyes reflecting a pain that mirrored his. She now understood the depth of what was at stake, and although scared, she seemed determined to face the truth alongside Richard. Richard held Laura's diary in his trembling hands, the weight of the revealed truth crushing him. The night was dense, and the rain drummed against the windows of his house as if the world outside shared in his inner torment. Amelia read Laura's words with tearful eyes, the hidden truths finally emerging from the abyss of secrets that had suffocated them for so long. The faint light from the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the room, reflecting the turmoil of their souls. Laura knew everything. Richard whispered, his voice choked by the weight of the revelation. Amelia lifted her eyes from the diary, her pale face reflecting the same disbelief and pain that Richard felt. She knew she wasn't my daughter. She knew about the ring and what it represented. The words barely escaped his mouth, as if each one carried an unbearable burden. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, a tension that seemed to intensify with each passing second. Amelia, with a firm and determined look, held Richard's hand. "We can't let this destroy us, Richard. We can't allow the past to control our future." Her words were a mix of hope and despair, a plea for them to find a way out of that labyrinth of pain together. They decided to confront Henry Ross, but this time not out of revenge or to blame. Richard knew he needed answers, but more than that, he needed closure, something that could help him move forward. When they arrived at the Ross house, they found Henry in the garden, sitting on an old bench as if he had been waiting for them. Henry looked at them, his expression tired. "I knew you would come," he said, without getting up. There was something resigned in his posture, as if he too was tired of carrying that weight. Richard approached, his words coming out with a mix of anger and sadness. Laura knew the truth, but she couldn't speak. "And you, Henry, let this happen." Henry sighed, the sound escaping like air from a punctured balloon. I was a man afraid, Richard. Afraid of losing my family. Afraid that the truth would destroy everything. I thought I was protecting everyone, but I was just fooling myself. Amelia approached, feeling the intensity of the moment. We can't change the past, she said softly, but we can decide what to do with the future. She looked at Richard, seeking support. What Laura wanted, what she wrote in the diary, was for us to find peace, to not let this cycle of pain continue. Richard and Amelia knew they needed to get rid of the ring, but in a way that ensured it would never again cause anyone pain. Sitting in the living room, they discussed several ideas, but all seemed flawed until Richard had an epiphany. What if the ring were undone? What if we turned it into something completely new? Amelia looked at him, intrigued. What do you mean? Richard explained. The ring is made of gold, and gold can be melted. If we melted it down and turned it into something else, it would lose the meaning and power people believe it has. It would just be an ordinary object. Amelia reflected on the idea and, after a moment, nodded, seeing the logic behind the proposal. They sought out a local craftsman, someone they could trust, who wouldn't ask questions. They wrapped the ring in a simple cloth and went to the small workshop on the outskirts of town. The craftsman, an elderly man with hands calloused by time and work, accepted the request with a look of understanding. I can do that, he said calmly, but I need to know what you want to create from it. Amelia, who had always felt a special connection with Laura, had an idea. What if we turned it into something that symbolizes a new beginning? Peace. She suggested a small golden dove, a universal symbol of hope and rebirth. Richard smiled, appreciating the simplicity and deep meaning of the choice. The process was simple but laden with symbolism. The gold from the ring was slowly melted in the furnace, the liquid metal shining with an intensity that seemed to reflect all the stories and emotions it carried. The craftsman worked carefully, molding the molten gold until it took the delicate shape of a dove. When he finished, he polished it until it shone with new life, completely different from the object it once was. Holding the small golden dove in their hands, Richard and Amelia felt a wave of relief. The ring, which had been a symbol of pain and mystery, was now something new, something that represented a different future. They decided to place it in a special spot, where it could serve as a silent reminder of the past, but without the weight of the curse the ring had carried. The small dove was placed in a quiet garden surrounded by flowers that Laura had loved. Richard and Amelia held a small private ceremony, planting a tree beside the spot. The tree, they knew, would grow strong and healthy, just as they intended to move forward, nurturing their own lives with new hopes and memories. In the end, the ring was not destroyed or lost, but transformed into something that no one could ever associate with its former power. It became part of a natural cycle, growing with the tree that now housed real birds, the only ones with the right to carry such a pure and liberating symbol. Richard and Amelia, as they looked at the garden, felt that they had finally closed that chapter, ready to start again, free from the shadows of the past. If you enjoyed Richard's incredible story, subscribe to our channel and activate notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. If you love exciting chronicles and want to support our channel to keep bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to continue improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next exciting chronicle.